Hello and welcome to this session. We are about 100 days away from COP26. Now, the purpose of the 26th UN Climate Change Conference is quite simple, in theory, to try to turn the ambition of the Paris Agreement into action that actually makes a difference to global warming. To assess what that means for the UK construction industry, I'm joined by three very knowledgeable experts. Paul King from Lendlease, Pavan Patel from Multiplex Construction, and Alistair Mant from UK GBC. I'm going to ask each of them to say a few words of introduction about themselves, starting with Paul. Paul.
Thanks very much, Lem. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here. As Lem said, my name is Paul King, and I head up sustainability and social impact for Lendlease across Europe. If you're not familiar with Lendlease, we're a large international property and infrastructure company. We work as an investor, a developer, a builder and an asset manager. So we work across the value chain of the built environment. And we're particularly focused on large-scale urban regeneration projects like our Elephant Park scheme in Elephant and Castle, IQL in Stratford in London. We've also got major projects in Milan and Birmingham and so on. And sustainability is deeply embedded in Lendlease's approach and philosophy and has been for a long time. And right at the top of our priorities is action on climate change. So we've set a target for our business across the globe to be net zero carbon for scopes 1 and 2. For those of you familiar with scopes of emissions, net zero carbon scopes 1 and 2 by 2025. But to be absolute zero carbon, that means across our entire business globally, scopes 1, 2 and 3 with no offsets by 2040, which we've described as a bit of a moonshot target in terms of completely decarbonising our business. So we're very much looking forward to COP and seeing how some of the rhetoric around climate action is being turned into reality and some real delivery, and crucially by our industry, which of course contributes something like 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Paul. Pavan, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Lem. I'm Pavan Patel. I'm a Senior Sustainability Manager at Multiplex Europe. Multiplex focuses on major developments, particularly around London and Scotland areas. And we span across commercial, residential, retail, and also healthcare. Multiplex, just a few months back, launched 1 Decade to Act, which is our net zero carbon pathway, including our supply chain emissions. A few of the big commitments that we've made over the past couple of years include science-based targets, the Wild Green Building Council net zero carbon buildings commitment, and also more recently, a commitment to the Steel Zero initiative. We recognise the role that our supply chain has in decarbonising our operations and then also the built environment. So a key thing for us is to collaborate with the value chain.
Thanks, Pavan. And finally, Alistair, if you'd like to go ahead. Alistair's going to speak for a few minutes by way of introduction as well about today's topic.
Thanks, Lem. Hi, everybody. I'm Director of Business Transformation at UK Green Building Council and a Chartered Surveyor and Environmentalist by training. And I oversee the scoping and delivery of a number of programmes focused on providing guidance and tools for the building industry. And at UK GBC, we collaborate with our 570 plus organisational members who span the property value chain from investor to developers, architects, engineers, product manufacturers, academia, and many of the major contractors. You're all here listening today. We also collaborate with an increase of other industry organisations to ensure that we help create additionality, consensus and clarity on the action required from government and industry. So the main areas that we work on are that political, industry guidance and solutions, and also leadership, with current major programs of work addressing both climate mitigation and adaptation. And I'll be touching on those in the next few minutes. So if we turn to COP26, I've been asked to do a bit of a scene-setting introduction there. It's really, I see it as an opportunity for the property and construction industry to demonstrate to the UK government that our industry is willing and able to play its part in both the journey to net zero carbon and also in adapting our places of work, home and play to the impacts of climate change. So through communicating bold commitments that are commensurate with the scale of the challenges, and importantly through demonstrating the solutions to achieve them, I believe we can create a positive feedback loop in which bold government policies are backed up with private sector leadership, which then reinforces further government policies and regulation. And together, through that, we can take climate action to the next level. You may have heard this described before, often called the ambition loop, and it's certainly a model used by the UN climate champions as we lead up to COP. As well as influencing the UK government, it's also an opportunity to inspire action in the slower moving organisations within our own and other industries. And let's be honest about it, it's a very supply chain that we have, very convoluted, very long tail, and not everyone is operating at the levels of Multiplex and Lendlease. So I think we can also show wider society that business can be part of the solution. And by having COP in the UK, it enables us to show off to the world and potentially, and importantly, new clients, our leading capabilities in financing, design, construction, and operation of both low carbon and resilient built assets. But we mustn't underestimate the challenges. They are really significant. We need to reduce UK emissions by 40% over this decade. We often say over the next decade, but in my head, I feel that kind of pushes it away. It's this decade and we're already 1 year into it. If we reduce by 40%, that will keep us online with a government's reduction target of 78% by 2035 from a 1990 baseline. And also with the IPCC and Paris goal of keeping global heating to within 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. We're currently not on course for this either nationally or internationally. The impact of COVID, and when you think about the scale of change there, is thought to have reduced emissions by around 6%. We need 7% year on year through this decade to get that 40% reduction. So let's not underestimate what we need to do. It also means that the need for adaptation is becoming more pressing because we're not decarbonising at the required speed. And I think we can probably all feel this now, I certainly can, in South London, that we're having some unprecedented heat, but also flooding around the world. You just need to look at the news headlines from the last few weeks. And it's actually indicating to climate scientists that change may be happening significantly faster than expected. In fact, the Climate Change Committee report on UK climate risk that was published last month was assessing 50 risks in terms of adaptation. And since 3 years ago, 60% of those risks have been given the highest urgency score. That means they need swift and effective action within the next 2 years. So in fact, on adaptation, it's 2 years. We've got this decade in terms of getting towards net zero. So 8 priority risk areas were identified by the CCC. One of those is the risks to human health, well-being and productivity from increased exposure to heat in homes and other buildings. Our industry is very much on the front line of climate change impacts. We need to decarbonise, but we also need to really quickly move to adapt to the coming changes that are already locked in. And the vast majority of our climate-related conversations in our industry, and in fact in wider society, is really focused on that carbon reduction piece. And I think one thing we need to do with COP26 is use it as a moment to accelerate the need for action on adaptation. With 2 of the 5 themes at COP being climate resilience and nature-based solutions that we can use to adapt, we really can grab that opportunity. I always quite like a quote that I heard James Bevan use of the Environment Agency in March, which is that net zero is about making things less bad than they would have been, but adaptation is about making things better than they are. So hopefully we can kind of find some inspiration in there and make that positive that we can try and create through adaptation and resilience. If we move on to COP, UK GBC is leading and involved in a number of initiatives to help industry demonstrate that commitment and that action. One of these is that we brought in a requirement for all our members to have a net zero carbon target. And we're also urging all our members to sign up to the World Green Building Council Zero Carbon Buildings commitment. At the moment, this is just on operational, to have operational net zero carbon buildings by 2030. But just next week, the World GBC will be launching life carbon commitment. And it's really key that we move to that whole life carbon mindset. And we're also urging all our members and requiring our 60 members to sign up to the UN-backed Race to Zero. So it's all part of showing to industry and others that commitment and leadership position in the industry. As part of COP itself, we've helped secure an official built environment day. So that's going to be something for all of us to do and as we can get involved in. So date for the diary on November 11th. But we're not sure if we're all going to be able to be there. We don't know what's after COVID will be. I think we can look at things like the Olympics, where we would have expected spectators. If they can't get it there, I'm not sure they're going to allow us to Glasgow in November. So we've led the creation through an industry coalition of a virtual pavilion, and this is going to showcase this and demonstrate the art of the possible. We're currently planning sessions at the moment, not just on net zero, but actually on how to measure and report the physical risks to built assets. And that's just as we've kicked off this week, a class group participants to help us in a project to produce industry guidance on that measurement and reporting side. And we're also planning an event on the vital issue of how to finance the required adaptation measures. The pavilion itself is a collaboration with over 40 other industry organisations, the likes of RICS, RTPI, ICE, BBP, and every other acronym that you can think of in the world of property and sustainability. As part of the official COP programme, we will also be in the net zero whole life carbon roadmap, and that whole life carbon bit is really key. And that's specifically for the UK built environment. We started that project back in January. It's brilliant that both Paul and Pavan are involved in that. And indeed, I think it's fair to say it's the biggest ever industry collaboration on low carbon, with more than 70 representatives from industry, government, and professional bodies contributing over 4 task groups and a steering group. It aims to create a common vision for the decarbonisation of the UK built environment by defining a carbon budget and trajectory for the sector. So there's going to be some nice graphs and nice line trajectories. It's been some pretty strong modelling, building on the low carbon roadmap from a number of years ago. But also there will be recommended actions, policies and processes that need to take place so that we can achieve that vision. And it's not just those 70 organisations that we want to feed in, and really, really importantly, we need everyone to come and support that so that it becomes a reality. And part of that is an industry-wide consultation on the draft findings, which is about to be launched later this week. We're also working on how we define and verify net zero carbon buildings. We've heard the clamour from society that that's absolutely crucial, and we're leading some industry work around that. Hopefully you're one of the 300 people that just participated in our online survey about what that should include and what should actually be the process to verify or certify a building to net zero. There's lots of other things going on, and perhaps I'll touch on them later. But I just want to sort of finish with the fact that all of this work is being built on the principle of collaboration. And this is what I want to leave you with. I'm actually taking part in the Club Peloton organised climate ride at the end of September, where we'll both be cycling, but also in the evening have a sort of mini conference and discussing these issues and what it means for property and construction. And I like to use the Peloton as an analogy for how I think we need to operate as an industry. So we need to work together. We need to ensure that efficiency of operation, but we also need those leaders sprinting off the front, trying new things, but for the rest of the pack to quickly join back up again, learn what worked, what didn't work, take that forward again at scale. And then we need someone else to make it net zero or make a launch for climate resilience. And importantly, all this time and effort that we and many others are putting into COP26 must result step up in ambition and action from industry and policymakers. And it's not about having an interesting but essentially ineffective 2-week conference. So for me, a great COP is one that marks the beginning of the stage of the journey towards combating the twin challenges of the climate crisis. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Alistair, and apologies to everyone if you had a little bit of trouble hearing Alistair from time to time there. I think we're all at the mercy of our internet connections these days. I'd like to pick up on a few of the things that Alistair has said there. Pavan, perhaps you can give us an answer to this. I mean, Alistair talked about our industry being on the front line. I'm interested to know, the UK is not only part of COP26, it's hosting it. Do you get a sense that the government has consulted with industry, understood the kind of issues that a company like Multiplex is facing in its large projects?
I think the government has, in a way, through various industry groups, the most recent and prominent probably being the Construct Zero framework. In that way, the government liaises with the industry bodies to develop a range of different performance targets and distill that down into something that would be applicable and relevant to the industry and to help drive the action that's needed. I think there is still some further consultation that can be done in terms of that communication between government and really understanding what the construction industry needs in order to achieve targets like that. But I think things like the performance framework that's been launched quite recently is a step in the right direction and something that I think will boost that communication going forward.
Thanks, Pavan. Paul, another of the things that Alistair touched on is the sheer range of bodies which are feeding into COP26. I think he talked about the acronym soup that's going on there. And within our own industry, there are all sorts of organisations which are trying to take a leadership position on decarbonisation and adaptation and all sorts of things. From your perspective, I mean, does that make things so much harder to work out who you should be following, where the guidance is coming from? What's your view?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, Lem, and it is one that's blighted our industry for a very long time. Necessarily, it's a very fragmented industry. There are lots of different elements and skills and disciplines within our industry, but the importance of coming together and providing some really clear and simple messages into government, I think, has never been more important. I was talking to Paul Morrell recently, who many people will remember as the former Chief Government Advisor, and he was grappling with some of these issues 10 years ago, and he was exasperated often then by the fact that the industry found it very hard to speak with one voice, and we were discussing that if ever there was a time and a place that we needed to do that, it would be COP26. And I think for that reason, it's incredibly important that UK Green Building Council is doing what it's doing, not only curating a virtual pavilion, which can go ahead and will go ahead regardless of whatever happens or doesn't happen in Glasgow physically, but also that it is a very broad virtual tent that anybody can come into. And I would encourage all industry bodies, professional institutes and associations to come into that tent, because we will get so much further if we go together and if we go with a very clear and consistent set of messages. So I know that UKGBC is actively sort of reaching out to many other trade associations, professional bodies and so on. And I think there's a real opportunity around the roadmap on whole life carbon for us to get really aligned on our messages. I think if we don't do that, there is a danger that government will be tempted to try and reinvent the wheel and try and look for answers when actually we have them already. We've been talking about zero carbon in the built environment industry here for 20 years now. We've learned a lot of lessons from previous forays into zero carbon homes, into things like the Green Deal. There's a long list of things that we've learned from, and we now really need to focus on the most important steps to get this industry on the low carbon trajectory that, as Alistair set out, it needs to be on for this decade.
Thanks, Paul. Alistair, I wanted to pick up on one of the major themes of COP26 is talking about the financing. How do we pay for the action that's needed? Are we expecting that question might be simplified by what comes out of COP26 about how the financing around carbon is going to work, or is it going to be more fudge and uncertainty? What do you think?
I think that, and apologies to everyone if it sounds not good. Hopefully it's a bit better now. But yeah, I think it's a really, really important area. And I think at the national level, we're not seeing the policy expectations backed up by the required funding. But when I look to the private sector funding, then that's where actually I get some of the biggest kind of bolts of hope. When you work on this every day and you look at the stats, it's quite easy to be overwhelmed. You head towards the despair end rather than the hope end of the spectrum. But when I look at what's going on in finance, I can see real change coming there, and things like the Asset Managers Alliance as well for net zero, that they're really also coming together and collaborating to make this happen. When I look across at some of the new members that we've had recently, people like Lloyds Bank and HSBC, and people who've been with us for a while, like NatWest Group, there's some really actually difficult work that they're doing. It's not all out in the public yet, but they're really grappling with how do they move their investment and their debt lending so that it is part of the solution. And it's not easy. It's a big system that we're trying to change, and they also answer to people who want their returns as well. But there's a lot of money continuing to chase kind of sustainable assets. And I think real estate is in a good place to show that we are a sustainable asset class, and that we can be where that debt and equity is put to safeguard those returns. I think one of the really important factors is that we work more closely with the finance industry so that we understand their expectations and that they understand what we're able to do and also what we're not able to do. And I think, again, it's a bit of collaboration. We get bored, people, of me saying this, but I think we need to reach out of our sector in terms of collaboration as well. And finance is one of those that we really need to get close to.
Thanks, Alistair. Pavan, if there was one thing that you were looking to come out of COP26, or perhaps from the government that would help sort of clarify things or galvanise action within the industry, especially at the end of the industry that Multiplex works in, what would it be? What would be on your wish list?
If I had to pick one thing, I think I would say mandating performance targets. I think over the past few years, various industry bodies have done an excellent job in coming up with performance targets for embodied carbon, and then also for operational emissions and energy use intensity targets. So an example being the London Energy Transformation Initiative, LETI, who have developed various roadmaps across whole life cycle carbon. So we have that data there about what good looks like and what we need now, what we need in 2025, and what we need at the end of this decade. What we need now, once we've got this data and now we know what the benchmarks look like, is some sort of mechanism to make sure that projects and developments have to achieve those. And whilst we do have some leaders in the industry who are pushing the boundaries and trying to achieve these targets on projects, there needs to be some government policies that enable these targets to be met from the very early stages of a project. Lots of the decisions that are made, which affect the whole life cycle carbon of a project, in fact, take place in the very early stages. And it's in those stages that we need performance targets to be mandated. So, for example, through policy, through planning conditions, things which are embedded into the building at the very start. I think once we have those sorts of targets mandated at the beginning, then the industry will be able to react to that and make sure we have the innovation and the technology there to achieve it. The investment will then drive, the technology will drive, and the solutions will develop.
Thanks very much, Pavan. Paul, I mean, one of the things that Pavan's talking about there is a bit of clarity, and the government's at the moment going through a process of basically tearing up the planning rulebook and rewriting it. Is there enough clarity in that process from your perspective about what's going to be expected?
I think there could be more clarity. I think a number of people have commented on the new planning guidance that's come out this week and the new design guide. I think there's some really positive steps in there, but I think it could go further in terms of being much more explicit about how we embed our net zero ambitions within the way that we regulate the built environment and that we plan the built environment. And I think this is across a number of different areas. I think one thing that we do need, Pavan's absolutely right. We need to look at an emphasis on performance, and that means real performance, not just how buildings are designed to perform. The industry knows very well that we've had a performance gap for a very long time. We can design a building to perform one way. How it actually performs in reality is often very different from that. So we need to get closer to actually the real emissions associated with buildings in operation. But we also need to broaden the scope of our regulation of buildings. At the moment, we only regulate operational energy use to heat, light, and cool our buildings. But we also know that if we look ahead to 2050, 50% of the carbon emissions associated with new buildings comes from the so-called embodied carbon, the carbon that goes into the materials, the steel, the concrete, and other materials that go into our buildings, which at the moment isn't regulated at all. So we do need to look at regulation extending across whole life carbon, looking at all of those elements as well to help drive the industry and drive those sectors that we rely on, the steel industry, the concrete industry, each of which would represent the third most polluting country in the world if it was a country after China and the US. Each account for 7 to 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So unless we start to regulate the use of those materials in terms of the embodied carbon impact they have in our buildings, we're missing the proverbial elephant in the room. I think the other thing is that what we will see is local government interpreting the guidelines in their own different ways. And sometimes that can be appropriate because solutions have to be locally appropriate. There isn't a one size fits all. The danger for the industry, however, is that they often find themselves having to comply with very different sorts of guidelines and requirements at a local level, which can be inefficient if there's lots of inconsistencies there. But we've got over 230 councils up and down the country that have declared a climate emergency. So they will inevitably interpret the central government's guidelines in the way that best help them achieve their objective. So the danger is if central government doesn't take a sufficient lead and isn't sufficiently clear, the industry will have to navigate lots more variation at the local level.
Thanks very much, Paul. Yes, some sound points there. Alistair, in your opening remarks, you talked about the importance of adaptation and being ready for the changes that climate change is going to bring to a practical level to the buildings we live and work in. Is there a danger that gets forgotten when people are focusing on net zero? Net zero gets all of the attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll back up what I said in. If everyone could hear me, I back up what I said in the little presentation is that I really do think it does get pushed, to the back of thinking, and I think that there's a worry of some unintended consequences in that there's, for very good reason, a lot of conversation about how do we get the existing stock. So it's great. We need our new buildings to be really aiming high and net zero basically from day one. But we've got all our existing stock, including millions of homes from even 100 years ago plus. So we need to do a massive retrofit to decarbonize. Also thinking about the changing climate and those physical risk impacts now, flooding, overheating, storm events with high winds, etc. Then we don't want to be retrofitting 2, 3 down the line again to combat that. So I think we need to start looking at them together. And again, I think a big push for the action that we've really seen this huge uptake in the last 18 months around net zero. Look at directors of sustainability now at every bank and asset manager and everyone else, even into private equity, finance industry. And a big push of that, again, is through things like the TD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, where it's now being required, those businesses that they invest in, and the underlying assets are often buildings or infrastructure. They want to know, where are you on the transition risk, and increasingly, where are you on the physical risk side as well. And the feedback we've had is that that's rather patchy, the evidence coming back from the real estate sector. And that's why we're just kicking off this piece of work now to, with integration again, to create guidance on what is best practice in terms of measuring physical risk to built assets and how that should be reported. And that's one of the key places that we want to bring the finance industry together with our sector.
Thanks, Alistair. And coming back to you, Pavan, one of the other things that Alistair said that really rang true or struck home for me was he was talking about it's this decade. It's not within the next decade. It's right now. And we've seen some criticism from the Committee on Climate Change about perhaps the government isn't doing enough. I mean, is it really up to companies like yours, tier one contractors, to take the lead and to make sure that they do everything they can to bring their supply chain with them? Is it up to industry to fill in if government's not moving quickly enough?
I would say, I think it's a combination of both. And I mean, it's a very important point made there around this is the decade to act. And in fact, that's why Multiplex's net zero carbon strategy is called One Decade to Act. I don't think it's fully up to industry to resolve the problem just because the government isn't acting fast enough. I do find that industry has tried to catch up over the last 1 to 2 years because of the government acting slower than expected and slower than the industry wants. However, there is a limit to, I think, how much industry can do, because there are still mechanisms that we would need within government regulation and financial systems to enable us to do the things we set out to do. So, for example, even within our own roadmap, there's a few elements within there where we're relying on government changes to create the impact across the supply chain that will help us to achieve our targets too. Things like tax levies on red diesel, financial mechanisms for aiding the steel sector to decarbonise. That's just one example with the steel sector. That sector needs quite a lot of heavy investment up front in order to develop the low carbon technologies, particularly through also CCUS. That money isn't just going to come from nowhere. Like, that will need to come from somewhere, and I think that's where the government needs to step in to at least put in the policies and the mechanisms that will create that investment. So whilst I appreciate it's not completely up to the government and industry still has a very big role to play, I think it's about collaboration between the two and working together to develop those solutions that we really, really need.
Well, thanks very much for those thoughts, Pavan. We're out of time now, so we have to move on to our next session. So thank you very much to Pavan, Alistair and Paul for sharing their insights this afternoon. Thank you.